Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a pivotal and often misunderstood moment in American history. The Compromise of 1850 and its ban on the slave trade in Washington, D.C. You might hear that and think, great, they banned the slave trade. But the reality is far more complex and, frankly, much darker than that simple statement suggests. So, grab a seat and let us unpack what this really meant for the nation and for the millions of people whose lives were defined by the brutal system of slavery. To truly understand the significance of this event, we have to travel back to the early and mid-1800s. The United States was a nation literally tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. On one side, you had the industrializing North, where abolitionist sentiment was growing stronger every day. Abolitionists, both black and white, were tirelessly campaigning, writing, and speaking out against the moral atrocity of human bondage. They saw slavery not just as an economic system, but as a profound sin against humanity. On the other side, you had the agrarian South, where the economy was almost entirely dependent on the forced labor of enslaved people. To the Southern elite, slavery wasn't just a part of their economy. It was the foundation of their entire way of life, their social structure, and their political power. They defended it fiercely, creating elaborate and twisted justifications rooted in racism and supposed economic necessity. This fundamental conflict created a constant, simmering tension that boiled over every time the nation expanded. With each new territory gained, from the Louisiana Purchase to the lands acquired after the Mexican-American War, the same explosive question arose. Would this new land be free, or would it allow slavery? Each decision threatened to tip the delicate balance of power in Congress between the free states and the slave states. It was a political powder keg, and everyone knew it. By 1850, the situation was at a breaking point. The discovery of gold in California had led to a population boom, and California was ready to enter the Union as a free state. This terrified the South. It would decisively shift the balance of power in the Senate in favor of the free states. Southern leaders began openly talking about secession, about leaving the Union altogether. The threat of civil war felt more real than ever before. Into this crisis stepped Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, a political veteran known as the Great Compromiser. He, along with Stephen Douglas of Illinois, cobbled together a package of 5 separate bills that would later be known as the Compromise of 1850. Their goal was not to solve the moral question of slavery, far from it. Their goal was purely political: to preserve the Union, to kick the can down the road, and to prevent an immediate bloody conflict. So, what was in this compromise? It was a classic political balancing act. For the North, the big prize was California's admission as a free state. But for the South, there were several major concessions. A much tougher Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which compelled citizens of free states, under penalty of law, to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped from slavery. This was a horrifying law that turned the entire country into a hunting ground for slave catchers and endangered free black people who could be kidnapped and forced into slavery with little recourse. The compromise also allowed the territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide the issue of slavery for themselves through popular sovereignty, opening the door for slavery's expansion. And then we come to the part we're refocusing on today, the ban on the slave trade in Washington, D.C. On the surface, this sounds like a victory for the abolitionist cause. And in one sense, it was. The sight of human beings being bought and sold in open-air markets in the capital of a nation that proclaimed to be a beacon of liberty was a profound international embarrassment. Foreign diplomats and visitors were horrified by the spectacle of human auctions. Chain gangs of enslaved people being marched past the Capitol building, and pens where men, women, and children were held like livestock. It was a glaring, undeniable contradiction to the nation's founding ideals. Abolitionists had long targeted the slave trade in D.C. as a symbol of the nation's hypocrisy. They published heart-wrenching accounts and illustrations of the markets, hoping to shock the conscience of the nation and the world. So, ending the public buying and selling of people in the district was a symbolic win. It appeased the northern conscience, at least a little, by removing the most visible and shameful aspect of slavery from the nation's capital. But this is the crucial part. We cannot overlook the law. Did not ban slavery itself in Washington, D.C.? Let me repeat that. Slavery remained perfectly legal in the capital. If you were one of the thousands of people already enslaved in D.C. in 1850, this new law changed nothing about your daily reality. You were still considered property. You could still be forced to work without pay. You could still be brutalized, and your family could still be torn apart. The law only stopped the commercial transaction of buying and selling new enslaved people within the district's borders . This created a perverse and cruel situation. While the open-air auction blocks in downtown D.C. were shut down, the so-called interstate slave trade continued. A slaveholder in Maryland could still legally bring an enslaved person into D.C. to work for them. More horrifically, the trade simply moved across the river. The nearby city of Alexandria, Virginia, which was actually part of the District of Columbia until 1847, became one of the largest slave trading hubs on the East Coast. Traders like Franklin and Armfield operated massive slave pens there, shipping thousands of people from the Upper South to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South. So, while the visible spectacle in D.C. was gone, the underlying machinery of the slave trade, the buying, selling, and trafficking of human lives for profit rode on just a few miles away. The ban was, in many ways, an act of political sanitation. It was about cleaning up the image of the capital city, not about dismantling the institution of slavery. It was a compromise designed to give the North a symbolic victory that cost the slaveholding South very little in practical terms. For the enslaved people in and around DC, the ban might have offered a sliver of psychological relief by removing the daily horror of the auction block, but it didn't bring them any closer to freedom. In fact, for many, the intensified domestic slave trade, fueled by the new Fugitive Slave Act, made their situation even more precarious. The threat of being sold down the river to the Deep South, a fate widely regarded as a death sentence, was now even greater. The Compromise of 1850 was ultimately a failure. It was a temporary truce, not a lasting peace. The deep-seated hatred and division over slavery could not be papered over with political deals. The Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, enraged the North and led to more people actively resisting slavery and supporting the Underground Railroad. The fragile peace it brought lasted only a decade before the nation finally plunged into the Civil War. So, when we look back at the ban on the slave trade in DC, it serves as a powerful lesson in how history works. It's rarely a simple story of good versus evil. More often, it's a messy, complicated story of compromise, of conflicting interests, and of symbolic gestures that hide a much more painful reality. The ban was a step, but a very small and deeply compromised one on the long and bloody road toward emancipation. It cleaned up the nation's capital, but it left the institution that stained the nation's soul very much intact. It reminds us to always look beyond the headlines of history and ask the deeper questions. Who did this law actually help? Who did it harm? And what underlying systems did it leave untouched? The story of the Compromise of 1850 isn't just about politicians in a room. It's about the millions of real people whose freedom and humanity hung in the balance. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into a complex piece of American history. I hope this gave you a new perspective on this important event. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content where we explore the past to better understand the present. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or any questions you have. I love hearing from you all. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.